Hello, everyone. Welcome. I feel compelled first to start out and just give everyone a sincere hope and well wishes that you are healthy, that your loved ones are healthy. We are obviously in some uncharted waters with COVID-19 and a lot of volatility out there. I can tell you, though, for us at the advisory, ecosystem advisory community, I've probably talked to about 20 to 30 of you in the last 2 weeks. And what's interesting is how much each of you have said that this community just got very, much more relevant to you, given the fact that we need a place to come and learn virtually, learn from our peers. There's no playbook that's defined in what we're all experiencing. And so I want to let each of you know that for us in the community, we're going to rise to that challenge. We're excited by the option of this becoming a real vibrant part of how you learn and evolve and iterate. And we're excited to kind of tackle a tough subject today, which is how do we keep that sales engine running in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is the format for today and how we'll look at things, and then introduce our guests who are going to be leading the discussion. So first, kind of in terms of our format or flow, we're going to have a thoughtful conversation from two sales leaders that are in the front lines of this right now, that are in innovative, progressive, SaaS-based businesses that are at the front lines of how do we take customer-facing resources and keep them productive and keep our engine running and maintaining the momentum in an environment where both our customers and our sales teams are at home. And I'm just so grateful. The thing that's terrific about this community is the fact that it really is members sharing their experiences with other members. And so in that regard, I'd love to talk through, we'll have a discussion on pipeline development, pipeline prosecution, how that works in this new normal that we're all experiencing. We'll also pivot into in-quarter execution. How do we make sure that we are predictable in delivering to the commits and promises that we have to the business? And then it's something that will probably touch all of these conversations. How are we responding in this COVID-19 world that we live in? And then finally, what we'd like to do, and we always do as part of a session, is give you a window into how other members are tackling this issue. So we'll spend the back probably 10 minutes of our time together showing you some digital strategies that members are using both for internal collaboration amongst their sales teams and external collaboration with their customers. So with that format, let's jump into our speakers. And this is something that I think is so special about our community, is that members volunteer their time and talent and perspective to kind of jump in and share what they're experiencing. And it is a true member-driven community. And so one of the co-leads today is Steve Fitz. Steve is the Chief Revenue Officer at Sumo Logic, a progressive, innovative SaaS company. Steve handles all aspects, all sales-related activities and customer-facing activities. He owns the sales, the channel, the customer success, professional services for Sumo Logic. Obviously a leader that's kind of at the forefront of how to deal with the new normal. And Steve's partner in this discussion is another Chief Revenue Officer, Brett Shirk. Brett runs and manages the entire global sales, go-to-market sales process and strategies and execution for Rubrik. And Steve and Brett are really, I think in our discussions with them, they are excited to not only share their experiences, but frankly, learn from the community. That's the power of what we're going to do here today. So although they're sharing, they're very open and interested to hear what your perspectives are and how you're dealing with this issue. So to that end, a little bit of a format. As we go through our discussion, there'll be kind of some logical pause points, you could think of them as, where we'll engage in some discussions. We'll just ask you to come off mute, share a perspective, and maybe facilitate a little bit of a dialogue, and then we'll move forward in our agenda. And so with that, we'll talk about pipeline development and prosecution. And to lead that part of the discussion, we'll have Steve start.
Good stuff. Thanks, Chad.
Sure.
Hey, on behalf of Brett and myself, we really appreciate this. I think Chad summarized it well. We're all lifelong learners, and we can tap into each other here. I think when we picked this topic up originally, it was a little bit different. Certainly, brave new world here the last couple of weeks, and it's changed from the way that we approach this, and we'll talk about some of that today because I think we're all still trying to figure that out. I've been on more video calls in the last 2 weeks than I think I have in the last 3 years. So we all get to see each other a little bit differently, but that's a good engagement too, right? I think we're doing these virtual happy hours and such, and it's a good way to connect with people. And I think the one thing we learned during this is you have to be, as a leader, you have to be empathetic. I lived through 9/11 in New York, and I think you have to understand that people process things differently. And, we're all kind of learning that. And, it's my piece of advice on people is don't assume everybody processes the same information the same way. But let's jump into it, because I think the topic here, and I choose this word prosecution wisely, and I kind of get criticized sometimes because for my own team, because of it, it sounds like, well, am I going to jail for something? I'm like, no, you're not getting prosecuted, because if you look at the definition of prosecution, it's the continuation of a course of action with a view of its completion. So as we get good pipe, at the end of the day, to sellers, what matters? Close one, right? So when I have a conversation with our CEO or CFO, it all comes back to, so, all right, that's great, Steve. Understand the metrics in between, but tell me what the close one number is, because that's really what matters at the end of the day. And there's a lot of, that's reality. There's truth to that. I think if you look at that across this spectrum, and why don't we go to the next slide? One of the things that we've done, and Brett and I have talked about this, trying to collaborate in terms of what we're doing at our companies, but what we've learned in the past and applying where we're at now, is we're actually generating about 50% of our pipe from our sellers. And I call the sellers both the inside sellers and the enterprise outside sellers. So we have a bifurcated team that's probably 60% enterprise, 40% mid-market. And so they're responsible for 50% of the pipe, and that the partner pipe includes in there 50%. But the other side of that is the collaboration with the marketing demand gen team. And there's an expectation and onus on them that the demand gen piece, whether that's inbound or outbound, and digital in that regard, is 50% as well. And if you look at this, and I can go back probably about 11 quarters now at Sumo, and we've actually achieved this at the macro level. We have not, if I go back down to the micro level of this leader in this particular geography, it might have a difference of that 50-50. But the first piece of that is making sure that there's a joint ownership of this. And I think one of the things we realize today is that if you're hiring an enterprise seller that's making, 250, 300K, they're not coming with the premise of, I'm going to create 100% of my pipe on a, day in, day out basis. And I don't think that should be the expectation. And, when you do this right, and, right becomes a, undefined term, it's a lot of collaboration between the two teams, marketing and sales. And you have to deal with a lot of candor in that regard, because not everything's perfect. And I think we kind of chop through that every week at Sumo today, in terms of trying to make sure that we're doing it right. So let me weave Brett in here to give his perspective on this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I've been a big believer in my career that pipeline generation is actually the function of the entire company. You have to have great technology. You have to have great support. All functions within the organization should be contributing to pipeline generation. It just so happens that it's cross-functional, and that you have accountability in each one of these functions for their support of pipeline generation. And what we realized at Rubrik was that we needed an ecosystem of resources surrounding the territory to ensure the territory is successful. And I think the conventional wisdom in the past was you hire a good AE and you hire a good SE, and all of a sudden, we're generating revenue, which is completely inaccurate. This is a team effort. And so what we've tried to do is make sure that we're aligned on campaigns and plays. So the other challenge is if you don't have coordination across these functional resources, then you get into a state of chaos, and then it's very difficult to hold people accountable. So what we've defined is what are the marketing campaigns that flow into sales plays that we can enable our teams on, and then we can go execute and to Steve's point, prosecute the pipeline. Because what we found is we had a lot of pipeline stuffing going on in stage 1, and very little of that was progressing to stage 2, and then even less was progressing to stage 3, when stage 3 is technical validation for us. So we actually had a T-shaped pipeline where we had a lot of junk in 1 and 2. We call it the feel good pipe. And then it narrowed down to 3, 4, and 5. And we really weren't doing a good job of making sure that we had qualified these opportunities into the next stage. So what we pivoted to this year, and we just started our fiscal year in February, is clear measures and accountability as part of each function and what they're responsible for. And ultimately, it is measured by closed won. And so what we're looking for now is a much more qualified pipe. And we're less focused on quantity. We're more focused on quality and the progression of those opportunities as they go through the sales cycles. But to Steve's point, we're 50% from a seller perspective, 50% from a marketing perspective. And then we measure at each stage of the pipeline how we're doing and how we're progressing those opportunities going forward.
I guess before we jump to the next one, is that consistent with what others are doing in terms of the 50-50, or people have a different alignment across that? And they're, if you look at that as well as, I guess, how do you hold each other jointly accountable? Because I think the challenge we've all seen with marketing is, from sales leaders is, holding each other accountable and making sure that it's not a blame game, but it's all, it's a collaborative game at the end of the day. Anybody have any feedback on that?
Yeah. Hey, Steve,
yes,
I don't know if you guys can hear me. This is Mark Tafakis from Sprinkler. It's good to see everybody. And so I put a bunch of stuff in the chat to the group, but 100%, we break it down by 3 internal contributing functions. The account executive directly, expecting them to have 50% contribution on their own efforts. And that's typically them owning A accounts. And so if we tier the territory in A, B, and C accounts, we're basically challenging the AEs. You own the A accounts, and you got to make sure it's a manageable number. And then we have an inside sales function that rolls up to marketing. And this is the first company that I've worked at where inside sales was a function within marketing and not sales. But regardless, we're asking the SDRs to contribute, and they're just responsible for lead generation. They're not carrying any transactional quota. So we're asking them to contribute 40, and then we have an alliances and partners organization, rolls under the sales umbrella, and we're asking them to contribute 20% of pipeline influence deals. And that's tracked in a weekly data pack. We use Domo, and it's an ELT data pack that then gets pushed down to the VP level, and then we share that as we see fit with our teams. But it's weekly. We track the progress, and we're very, very detailed on lead and lag metrics, because we know that closed revenue doesn't magically happen. And so my guidance would be to look at, like, what are all the major lead metrics that drive the activity, and then how does that progress through a sales funnel? You're tracking that with metrics that lead to closed won.
That's great feedback. That's anybody else have anything unique or different that you do with that? And I think the other thing we'd love to hear on is how do you hold each other accountable across that spectrum?
Yeah, Steve, this is Someshwar. I really like the way you opened it up with the split of sellers between inside and outside. From a CRO's perspective, I wanted to ask you, Steve and Brett, do you all also measure rolling 4 quarters pipeline? Because some companies just live quarter on quarter, and they need to measure outcomes by quarter. Do you look at any kind of rolling pipeline? Because we all have different best practices of pipeline by the year, but I just wanted to check on the rolling quarter pipeline.
Brett, you want to take that first?
Sure. So thanks, Sumesh. We look at current quarter and current quarter plus 2. We think, current quarter and 2 quarters out is about as best we can do at this point. I find it very difficult to do a 4-quarter rolling pipe, just, the challenges associated with visibility that far out. We also this year moved to 6-month comp plans. So I think this gives us good visibility to be able to manage the current quarter plus 2, given we're on a biannual compensation and quota allocation plan. That's how we're managing here at Rubrik.
And I'd say we're pretty consistent with that. Sorry, we're probably plus 1 quarter out, plus 2. I think the thing that we found on that, back to the point that was made earlier, it's, if you get happiness with this, hey, my pipe's, 7X over this year. What really matters is, are you moving that pipe along that spectrum in the different stages that Brett talked about earlier, and we'll talk about in a second, to make sure that the customer's moving along with you, or the prospect in that regard. So.
Hey, Steve, real quick, one thing to add on that. That's such a great comment there about the progression across the sales process. We weight our forecast. So through historical data, we have a percentage of likely close in each of the 7 stages or 6 stages of our sales process. And then we're looking at not just visible opportunities holistically. Like an AE could say, hey, get off my back. I've got $2 million of, visible pipeline, which is like 3X of my quota. We actually say, yeah, but the likelihood weighted of you bringing that in at this point in the quarter is like 1/8, because it's all in earlier stages of the forecast. So that's another metric.
Yeah. Hey, Morris Wallach, formerly from 3D Systems and Hewlett Packard. I'm glad to be here, Chad and team. I think to that same point, I was going to add, when Brett was talking about the happy pipe early in the sales cycle, is we did a lot of work on what we call step of sale exit criteria, being really crisp, or getting crisper on, like qualification, what actually needs to happen in the sales process, with evidence in a sales review weekly that it actually happened before we said it moves to the next stage. Because we had a lot of people moving things, and then as we inspected it, we found, well, how in the world did this get to proposal stage? If, an example, in 3D Systems, a lot of our 3D commercial and large industrial opportunities needed benchmarking. And if the benchmark wasn't completed, how in the world do you get to proposal? Because you can't possibly propose a solution until you know whether the material and the part could be built. So we got a lot more rigorous on unpacking the qualification to behavioral things we could observe at each stage in the sales process, and then clean the pipe of stuff that was old and unqualified, and then rigorously use those step of sale criteria to get a more higher confidence in each step of sale, to the other gentleman's comment, because we also did weighted forecasts based on where in the sales process they were.
It's good feedback. I think let's jump to the next one, Kasha, because I think it'll actually help this conversation a little bit. When Brett and I were talking about this is something that we've actually put together at Sumo and been using for the last, 9 quarters now. And we look at this as kind of like our pipeline prosecution across stages. And then the importance of this, so we try and generate 5X on the front end. And, the dynamic that we'll talk about, as we progress through this conversation, is that, some of that pipe, or, a lot of that pipe is actually show pipe, as in the different shows that we attend and the folks that you meet and the interactions you have during that. So that dynamic, obviously, in the world we're living in now, has changed quite a bit. So it's actually even more important now to focus on, quality of pipe, and then how do I prosecute across that spectrum. So what we benchmarked here across these stages, and I'm just using our stages because we have 8 different stages, from stage 1 being the meeting set, and then stage 8 being close won. And then what we did, looked at a couple different industry benchmarks, and then talked to a lot of other pure play SaaS companies. So we found that, this dynamic of 60, 50, 40, and I'm a big believer of simplicity, of if you're going to teach people how to do something, make it simple. So 60% from stage 1 to stage 2, 50% from stage 2 to stage 4, and then 40% from stage 4 to stage close 1, stage 6 to stage 8. And that's 60, 50, 40. And then I've used our benchmarks here because, candidly, nothing's perfect in any of our worlds. And we struggled with how do we move stuff across that spectrum, in our case, from stage 2 to stage 6, and making sure that we're doing things like a contextual POC, POV, and not just doing what, now we commonly refer to as a harbor tour demo of just a generic demo of our solution versus if I'm working with somebody that's in the e-commerce space, give them a, customer checkout experience that shows how the solution actually enables them from, and it benefits them from the business problems that they might, have across that spectrum. So, Brett, you want to add anything to this or?
Yeah. So one of the things that we felt like we needed to do and we implemented this year was much more rigor around the process associated with advancement of opportunities through the sales stages. So we got very tight on what the description is, what the criteria is for an opportunity to move through the stages. And so we're doing biweekly pipeline reviews, going very deep on ensuring that we are inspecting the pipeline properly and that we have validated pipeline before we move it to the next stage. And so I agree with Steve. A lot of these things are much more. We need much more focus on ensuring that we've got a process around how we accept, how we move forward, and how we ultimately get the pipeline to close 1. And I would say that, the challenge that we had before, and I think I mentioned this earlier, was just not having qualified pipe and moving it into into ours would be stage 3, which is tech validation. It's really a waste of resource and time for both the prospect and for Rubrik. So we want to be much tighter on how we get to that phase. Once we get to tech validation, we have a 70% win rate. So getting qualified into that stage is critically important, and it will ultimately increase our close 1 over time.
Yeah, I think there's some questions that came in on, and I let's get to that in a second, because I think one of the things here that we've leveraged, just feeding off what Brett said, is it making sure that there's 2 things that work across the spectrum. One, there's extreme collaboration across the handoffs. So if you look at it from stage 1 to stage 2 is a lot of SDR to rep, whether that's an inside rep or outside rep. And then stage 2 to stage 4 is really a teaming effort with the rep and the SE in that regard to make sure that they understand some of the challenges, the business issues that the customer's up against, and then they can create a POC demo that is more contextual and reaches the customer in the right way. And then, if you look at that, the rep is responsible for obviously stage 4 on, but we also want our leaders to drive this to own kind of this pipeline prosecution, because, we're all opportunity driven, and a forecast is delivered, a lot on, hey, what opportunities am I working on this month, this quarter? But if you're doing this right and you're spending, the fair amount of time doing that with your individuals and your team, you're helping them and coaching them across that spectrum of how to, make sure that the pipe is, pipe's not free. We spend a lot of money on marketing, and we need to, if we want to, I put this back on our own team. If you guys want to get more marketing dollars, we got to show our conversion rates are better across that spectrum, and we'll give you more marketing dollars to be able to do it. I think, Chad, one of the questions that came in here is about the marketing contribution.
Yeah,
So,
there's one on, so to credit to you guys, the chat is blowing up in a good way. And so I'm summarizing one is just on the contribution of marketing to that pipe and close would be one to comment on. And then After that, maybe we'll have Grad come in, who's a senior sales leader. He has a direct question for Brett on his kind of quarter plus 2 out. Those would be ones that we can maybe address here. How do you guys think about the contribution percentages of marketing and sales around their pipeline contribution for marketing in particular in closed deals?
You want to go first, Steve?
We kind of hold each other jointly accountable for that. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what we've learned probably in the last 12 months is that we get a better ROI on digital than we do anything. And digital for us is kind of both outreach, but also nurture. So, am I retargeting somebody, but also making sure that they're, actively touching us from a website interactive standpoint. And we don't try and, sell those customers initially. We just nurture them. And I think I've learned this from others, that the nurture piece, because if I'm trying to sell you something, and, our buyers are typically, tech buyers. So they don't like to be sold to, they like to be enabled in that regard. So, that's, but from a contribution perspective, I think the digital piece of what marketing is responsible for, and that nurture piece especially for account-based marketing, has been a, tremendous asset for us for quality of pipe and quality of that contribution of the leads we get from that side.
Yeah, from a Rubrik perspective, we've actually broken it down very specific on what we expect from marketing generated leads, trade shows, percentage of the total, what we're doing with channel marketing, digital, webinar. So we actually have it broken down very detailed on where we're spending our marketing dollars and how that's contributing to the pipeline. And we expect 50% of the pipe to be determined and contributed to by the marketing team. So that's something we've really doubled down on this year to ensure that we're spending our money wisely and we're getting the proper contribution from the marketing organization.
Hey, Brett, just channeling some feedback in the chat. So one question comes from a senior sales leader at Gainsight, which says, Brett, what are the key criteria to be qualified to move somebody to tech validation in your perspective?
Yeah, we look at a couple of things. So number one, is there identified budget for the project? 2, have we met the economic buyer to ensure that we're aligned on going to that next phase of the opportunity? Those are the 2 big ones. We want to make sure that, and the third one is, does our technology actually meet the criteria, and has criteria been defined? Because all too often we get an opportunity, we want to go to POC just because we don't have enough funnel in that particular territory, but we haven't qualified the opportunity to a point where we feel that it is a legitimate opportunity to advance into a closed won deal. So those are the criteria, and there's probably a little bit more granularity, but those, from my perspective, those are the things that we want to make sure that we have before we move into spending resources on a POC.
And if I could just add to that, I think one of the things that Brett talked about is the, what we find a lot for especially the territories that don't have enough pipe is they jump to a POC too early. Yeah. And you really have to coach your sellers to overqualify, and almost force the customer to ask for the POC or the demo in that regard versus jumping to it. We find a lot of our sellers jump too quick.
Agreed.
I'd like to invite into the conversation Bill Welch, who has some questions for you, and I'd love to let him come off mute and have some time with you guys.
Cool.
Bill, you able to?
Yeah, sorry, I got dropped there. So I had a couple questions for the group and for Brett and Steve. So when you look at this from a stage perspective, so Brett, I know you've been at large companies, the Symantec's and that of the world, and then now at a large startup, but it's not necessarily a pre-IPO Series A company. how does any of this differ in your experiences as far as the pipeline, the prosecution of it, and even on the conversion rates? Like Steve, you mentioned, it looks like you're having about a 20% conversion rate on your new business. Are you guys breaking this out on new and upsell too? So a multi-part question, and I got more, but I'll just go with those two for now.
I could start, Bill, as you know, our time together at Symantec, where we had so many different product lines, very not clear on what the strategy and vision of the company was, very difficult to manage pipeline across so many different business units. And that made it very complex to really put a true pipeline generation engine in place. What I see at Rubrik is completely different. We're very focused. We know what our target audience is, what our target TAM is. And so with that, we are very focused and have the ability to create campaigns and plays that are relevant to our customers that drive differentiation in the marketplace. So from my perspective, in a company where you have a defined market, you have a defined addressable market, and you have clear differentiation, it's much easier to put a pipeline generation engine in place versus a large company where you have multiple product lines and a lot of different contributors across the organization.
I think Bill, on that, if you look at it, we it goes back to a couple things. I think if you have size and scale, we don't have as many folks in the process that have feel like they have an input, which I think is helpful in many ways as you're smaller, but as you grow, then more people want to have a say. I think the process needs to be understood, communicated, and everybody's got to understand what their accountability is in that process. And I think, take an example of that, like partners, for instance. If I look at partners, and partner pipe actually comes in for us probably stage 3, stage 4, because it's better qualified. It typically has it's already qualified from the partner rep in that regard. And candidly, actually for us, we've seen a different conversion rate for the partners. So it's actually forced some investment on our side, or actually triggered some investment on our side of, hey, we can get better pipe from our partners and go against that. But we measure new logo, we measure upsell, cross sell the same way. We're relentlessly focused on new logo and what we learn from that. And, as I said earlier, I think our biggest challenge that we've seen is kind of like stage 2 to stage 4 from moving somebody to really a demo that matters. But it goes back to a lot of the things that Brett talked about of, do you really have the budget, the need, the authority, and the business issue that you're addressing? And in many ways, our sellers are chasing after every squirrel that's in the road, but we have to coach them on that.
Yeah. I love the dialogue and questions. I'm going to I think Brad wants to come off mute, senior sales leader, to ask Steve and Brett a question. And then I think we're going to pivot to some discussions in COVID-19 and in-quarter execution. But first, Brad.
All right. Hey, good afternoon. Hey, thanks a lot, first of all, Brett and Steve, for sharing this great stuff. I got a question on the partner side and how you're managing pipe that is partner-led. So in our case at HP, we've got assigned end user accounts with named end user reps on them, account managers, but some of our leads are still coming in from our partner community. I'm interested tactically in who has responsibility or accountability for entering in pipe when it's coming from a partner, and how you keep that clean. Because we've had a little bit of challenge at HP where, the rep would lob it in themselves, the end user rep, and not give credit to the channel for where the lead came from.
Yeah, so I can start, Steve. So we use the nomenclature PID, JID, RID. So partner initiated deal, joint initiated deal, or Rubrik initiated deal. We're running about 60% PID, JID. And we police this. It is responsibility of the opportunity owner to enter it, but we police this pretty closely to make sure that we've got the right allocation based upon how this opportunity materialized. So that's how we're measuring. We do it all in Salesforce, and our CDMs are responsible for ensuring that that the opportunities are put in as a result of in one of those three categories.
Yeah, and I think the thing, Grad, that we do is, so we have a registration process for our partners. We allow our teams to, I think they have an SLA that they have to respond within 12 or 24 hours to that opportunity once it's registered. And for many ways, we gravitate to the partners because they're bringing the opportunity to us and let them register that deal. And, there is an incentive for them for a registered deal in that regard. So incentive on that side, and there's an incentive for the direct sellers to work with the partner community and not care really in that regard where it comes from. But it's, I think there's some checks and balances that you have to put in place to be able to, foster that and make sure that it's the right behavior.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Thank you.
Thanks,
guys. Yeah, this is terrific. So I'll let Steve take it back into our flow here.
So, as we get through, the qualification, I think part of this is, our ask to the audience here is that, what are the strategies that, everybody's using for better qualification and prosecution? And we talked about some things in terms of the different stages, but, proof of concept, proof of value, I think, at least in the SaaS world, has probably become evident to me that, we're up for reelection and sometimes every year. And if you're not getting value or delivering value to the customer in that regard, somebody in finance, somebody that, a new person in the organization is going to challenge that and, go back to what they're comfortable with. So I guess the question to the broader audience here is does proof of concept, proof of value resonate? And then are there any different strategies or approaches that any of you are using in that regard for better qualification across that spectrum?
Steve, I'll begin. In my case, we took a little different approach last year. Instead of just measuring the team by SQLs or sales qualified lead, we also introduced a new element called SQO, which is sales qualified opportunity, which means the inside sales rep needs to partner with the pre-sales and the field reps until a qualified dollar amount is tied to that opportunity. That drives the right behavior, and it also drives a stage progression. And so far, it's been working well. The CRO and the CFO love it.
That's good. It's a joint accountability, right? Anybody else? Why don't we jump to in-quarter execution? Brett talked about references earlier, and I think the importance of this is that, we talked about, somebody had a question earlier about how, what do you measure a pipe for how many quarters? And I agree with Brett's context on this. I think a quarter or two is probably, the most, to me, from a pipe perspective, it's, real pipe. I'll turn it over to Brett to talk, to kind of lead this part of the discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Yeah. One of the things, when you're in a late stage startup company, pre-IPO, the most important thing that you have to focus on is ensuring that you have predictable results. And one of the challenges that we've been faced with is predictability in our business. And so I think it's twofold. One, you have to have the pipeline to support the goal quarter over quarter. And I liked one of the comments about weighted conversion. We're moving to weighted conversion as well, based upon historicals. Now, those historicals could get disrupted based on what's going on with COVID-19 right now, but getting more accurate in how we predict our business, other than just forecast reviews with the sales organization. The other thing that we want to make sure that we were doing consistently is how we prosecute deals, how we execute on deals in quarter. So we've gone to a simple format. It's 3 whys: why anything, why Rubrik, why now. The second part of it is we use MEDDIC as our sales play and how we run the business. So we want to make sure that we're crystal clear on all elements of MEDDIC. And then the third thing that we review consistently for deals is reverse timeline and ensuring that we have a path to closure. So we do, I do all $1 million plus deal reviews in those three category, it's 3 slides with the team. my VPs do 500K to $1 million, and then the expectation is 100K to 500K is the first line leaders. So we've implemented this, and now we've become much more predictable. We're at plus or minus 5% by the week 8 forecast call to the end of quarter finish. And so we're early stages on this, but we want to make sure that, we do what we say we're going to do, and that we're predictable in our business to ensure that we deliver quarter over quarter. I always say that we don't have a forecast problem, we have a pipeline problem, or pipeline challenge. If you've got the appropriate pipeline, qualified pipeline, then you can be much more predictable in your efforts in quarter execution. But it becomes critically clear, and it's going to become even more of a challenge as this COVID-19 thing continues to disrupt business. So we're going to have to be very, very tight on making sure that we've got tight alignment with our customers and partners on how we execute in quarter deals.
I think the only thing I'd add to that, it's a good discussion, but the point on that is just making sure that we as sales leaders kind of tend to focus on the forecast in the quarter, and you really got to take the time and energy to inspect the pipe and understand what's going on, and take it down a level or two with the frontline sales leadership. They need to own it at the end of the day. And I'll be honest with you, I mean, we're struggling with some leaders that don't really understand the aspect of that and how important that is in terms of building a business, a sustainable business. But that's an obvious coaching opportunity. But you really have to take the time and energy to understand the stages and why stuff isn't moving through the pipe faster. And it's, as Brett said earlier, it's not a check the box thing.
Hey Steve, I can jump in. It's Robbie Trauber from Zora. And one of the things that we've done that we've had good success with on the accuracy is we also look in quarter, but we're also consistently looking at how much stage 4 for us, which is a critical stage, you have in preparation for the next quarter. So we're constantly looking at that aspect to say, okay, what have you got going this quarter? But then we alternate, especially earlier on in the quarter, between what's in quarter forecast and what is pipeline. So that every sales leader has that alternating perspective. So we say, look, we'd like to get to 100% of next quarter quota in stage 4 by the time you enter the next quarter. So it's not saying that we're there yet, but it's a very good driving structure to say that, okay, are we looking at all the exit criteria against each of the stages? So if you've got a lot of stage 3 at the moment, what are you doing to get these into stage 4 in preparation for the next quarter? And we found that has really drives people into thinking about being prepared for the next quarter, and that helps the accuracy a lot.
It's a really excellent point. I think it goes back to qualified pipe. I mean, once you get to stage 4, that should be very qualified pipe that's ready for the next stages to close. One of the other things we found too is our average sales cycle is 145 days. So we actually develop about 20% in quarter pipeline that goes to close. So ensuring that we continue that pipeline generation engine, not just for future quarters, but in quarter opportunities, is critically important. But a really great point on the qualified pipe stage 4 and above for next quarter.
I'd like to comment on the 3 whys. It's Pete Smerald. Because I ran an experiment at Seismic in Q4. What I found was that the reps really produced some lame 3 whys, right? They were all operationally focused. They were rarely strategic. So I just took a segment of the business and started pounding through them, right? Focused the value team on actually constructing the 3 whys and just handed them to the reps. And I found that it made a significant difference in the quality of the deals. So, you could do one in about 15, 20 minutes. So it's not really burdensome, but having that consistency and raising the quality of it makes a big difference.
Totally agree. I'm sorry, I totally agree. And that's part of the deal review process, is to challenge those 3 whys, because we get a lot of fluff, nonsense stuff in there that really is not tied to value. So really great point. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I was just going to comment there. It's Mark. Same exact problem we had. We're on the three whys in our business. And it was loose, and it continues to be loose. And the best way that we were able to kind of tackle that all the way down to the director of sale review with the AE was it was metric based. So when you think about why anything, we were looking for quantifiable metrics back to like business strategy and business outcomes for the company we were selling to. So what was that number tied to revenue, cost containment, or risk to the brand? The second one on why in this case, why Sprinkler, was based on very specific use cases and unique and comparative differentiation that put us ahead of the competition in consideration. And then the third one on why now, which typically tends to be the hardest why, was the business case. You know, if you give us $1, are we giving you $10 back? How is that driving revenue? How is that driving cost containment, and so forth? So instead of just putting textual response to each of those buckets, it was all quantifiable, and then we felt that we had better consistency in the the quality of the deal.
Good point.
Agreed.
Great dialogue. We're coming up about 10 minutes before our time, and just love the interactions that have taken place organically to date. What I wanted to do at this point is maybe invite Tricia Murphy into our discussion. One thing that we're very cognizant of in running the community is that you are given a lot of the visibility of how members are dealing with the issues that Steve and Brett have put up in place. And so what we've tried to do is bucket these in terms of 2 things. You know, Brett made an interesting point just a moment ago, which is in a post-COVID-19 world, you really have to have a tighter level of alignment on how the account team's forecasting and prosecuting the opportunities and the conversations you're having with your external customers. And so many of you in the community, which is now 60+ companies and 80+ executives, are doing some interesting things on what we would call internal digital collaboration. How are we making sure that we have no light between us on the account team on this opportunity? And how are we also doing external collaboration digitally with our customers, and having those 2 worlds feed each other? So we wanted to show some examples of how you are using it, various members are using it, to give you a view of it, and then we'll return back to Brett and Steve with some closing comments. So with that, I'll let Tricia join in.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tricia Murphy, and I'm a value consultant here at Ecosystem. So I spend the majority of my time in the field with sellers, helping them structure and quantify value. So what I just wanted to show you, and I'll go through this fairly quickly, is in today's world, as Chad said, of COVID-19, we need to just make sure that we continue to collaborate with our customers. And so when we look at it from an internal perspective, I just wanted to show you a couple best practices that we've noticed in the field here, and then move into a couple of external best practices that we have. So there was a lot of talk about the 3 whys and MEDDIC, and I know a lot of you are using them in this case. And if you just look at this, very quickly as we look at, if I borrow from Morris, who talked about changing behavior, and Steve talked about using rigor and inspection in qualifying the pipeline, this is one way that it is happening. So again, within Salesforce.com, you have a framework here that allows a rep and a manager to make sure that they're inspecting their pipeline correctly. So if you look here, this is what's called the value prompter in this case, and this is where we're really trying to get the reps to dig into what those 3 whys are. And then Diana, if you go into the next one, and I should just point out, I'm not used to not driving here, but you can see across the top there, you go from left to right from a value prompter in the 3 whys. You go and you look at the value pyramid, and then we're going to look at the current and desired state, and then we're going to look at quantifying those outcomes. And so in this pyramid that we're looking at right now, this is where we're coaching the reps to truly understand what those desired outcomes are from the customer. And again, and I know this is, might be a little hard to see everything, but this is what the customer is looking for, not, of course, what the rep is looking for. But in this case, in going through that pipeline prosecution, all of this needs to be not just checked the box and filled out, but thought through and discussed with the customer. The one thing too, and Bill, I know Bill is on the phone, Bill Welch used to do this, is not only is this what the rep is doing and what the rep is finding out, but we also can look at what the customer is saying and what are the customer's reaction. And a lot of times as we look at qualified pipe, we want to kind of turn the tables and again, just assess and evaluate what the customer is doing. On the next one, if you go to the next one, Diana, again, this is where we're spending time kind of identifying that current state of where that customer is today, what they're identifying as their pain points, looking then at what that future state looks like and what is the desired state, and making sure that it's documented. The other benefit of this, of course, especially in today's world of working from home, is that we have a single view of where an account is. We're not dealing with PowerPoints. We're not dealing with some things in Salesforce. I mean, everything is in the framework of Salesforce, but we have a documented area of what's happening, the intelligence of that account within one framework here. So, this is where we want to get the buy-in. And then finally, thank you, Diana, this is where we would transition. And again, once it's qualified, if we go into the proof of value or the proof of concept, we have those outcomes that are identified by the customer. And now we're at a point where we want to go external. And again, we're still using the same exact digital platform, and we're just moving from that internal conversation that we're having with the customer to an external conversation that we're having with the customer. So from here, we would go into, as you said, Mark, a business case. This is where we want to start quantifying those outcomes with the customer. And Diana, if you go to the next page, it's funny. I'll just tell you a quick story here. I was helping one of my colleagues with reporting today for one of our customers, and the customer wrote back and she said, oh my gosh, how did all these people get in the system? And what we're seeing just in the last couple weeks is that more and more people, and you can see here in this little graphic, that we have the customers collaborating with the seller more and more, and I know this happens a lot with grad, but more and more end customers are in that external collaboration digital platform that we have, because everybody is working from home. So before, where it was, maybe one person or, was working from home or would call in and there would be 3 customers sitting at the table. Now we have 3 customers in 3 different households, and we have the seller, and then we have the SE, and then we have someone else, and they're all able to, in a digital platform, collaborate. And so this is the graphic on that. And then finally, Diana, one of the things that we're really starting to experiment with, and we have a couple of customers that are doing this right now, is, and those that are really seeing a lot of activity and success and engagement, in that as we're in this COVID-19 world, right, and it's forcing us to start talking about things other than the functional benefits and the functional outcomes that we're used to talking about, and the sellers being pushed to justify their budgets in things like these other elements of value that we have around for example, reducing anxiety. The teddy bear is my favorite, but looking at how we as an organization can be more flexible in this crazy time, and having the ability to actually put a structure around that to arm that end customer to have that conversation has been, again, just in the last couple of weeks, something that yesterday could have been seen as ephemeral, as today as being a must-have for the way we're talking to our customers today. And so, Chad, I went in assuming that everybody is aware of our partnership with Bain, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
And then as we're incorporating that, I'll just show this. This is where we would quantify and identify those outcomes.
Thank you, Tricia. And maybe we just go back one slide for Diana. So folks, everyone in the community, to Tricia's last point, should know that Bain and Company are charter members of this community. And so they have put together what they call a COVID-19 business case. You know, what are the things that we should, as providers, be accentuating in this very volatile environment? And they've aligned it up to these 6 elements of value. And so all of that research we can make available to community members. All of the COVID-19 business cases that are kind of being seen and activated upon will be available to members going forward as an outcome. So we just wanted to let you know what the screens and different shots that you've seen, both on the internal collaboration side and here on the external, are all things that your peer community members are doing. And we will make sure that that's available to the larger community going forward. And maybe that's a good segue before I want to bring it back to Brett and Steve for some closing comments. But one thing to remember, hopefully for everyone here, is we have this concept of a concierge service. So as a member of the advisory ecosystem, if you were really taken by something Brett said and Steve said, and that was such a great discussion, and you want to have some more dialogue on that, or there was a particular digital platform that was represented today that you want to get more curious on, simply just come back to Kasha, who leads the community, and we will take on the efforts of getting you connected to the right community member for you to have a member-to-member conversation on what's happening. You know, we really feel like that's part of our value add, is to make sure we're making the connections for you across the various different members. Finally, before I hand it back to our 2 hosts, is just a little outline of what we've done in terms of our content agenda, where we're going. This session rocked it, and I'm just so grateful for Steve and Brett to be so forthcoming. It just speaks to their leadership in their class of the way in which they handled this session and shared what they're doing. It makes the community special. So I'm grateful to both of them as leaders, as people that I'm inspired by, and this session in particular. You'll see in our content going forward, we're doing a lot on this concept of virtual selling. Is the next one around April 23rd. In the new world we live, how are we going to be effective in that? We've got a session with the customer success folks that we're looking at forecasting and retention in a COVID-19 world. We have sessions on these elements of value that you saw a screenshot on. We've got a great session we're working on with Steve Thompson, which is, you know, how do you get credit in this environment? And how do you ensure that you're empowering your customer to have great, thoughtful conversations with their internal customers? So just a lot that's going to be done over the weeks and months to follow to arm this community with the best thinking, the best strategies on how to be effective in this very volatile environment. So with that, I want to bring it back to Steve and Brett to take us out, and any closing comments that you guys have.
Hey, thanks, Chad. Well said. Grateful to have the opportunity to do this with the collective group here. I think I got a chance to know Brett in this, get to know Brett in this process, and a lot of respect for him. And as Chad said earlier, I'd happy to connect with anybody on a one-to-one. I've done that with Bill and Grad in the past, and this community of what we're doing, we learn together, and that's the best thing we get out of this. My last message to everybody is stay positive
and healthy.
Amen.
So yeah. So yeah, same comment, Steve. Grateful to have the opportunity to work with you on this. Learned a lot from you. Chad, always a pleasure, an honor and a privilege to be part of the things that you're doing with ecosystems. And wish everybody all the best in these challenging times. Stay focused, keep activity high, stay healthy, and we'll come through this together. This too shall pass.
Amen. Thanks all.